I've told this story twice. Once to a fleet debriefer on way station Octet 8's emergency med deck, 3 hours after it was over, while a medic was still pulling thermal scoring off my left forearm with a pair of tweezers. That version was clipped, factual, and probably useless, because I kept stopping to answer questions they already had the answers to. The second time was to my daughter Patatong, who was 9 years old at the time, and met me at the transit gate when I finally got home, and she looked at the burn on my arm, and at Kulas walking beside me with the same slow amble he always had, and she said, "Tate, is the dog okay?" "Not am I okay, the dog." I told her he was fine. She said, "I knew he would be." I've been trying to figure out how to tell it right ever since. The debrief version was for the record. This version is for her, when she's old enough to understand that sometimes the record misses the point entirely. My name is Magnomenises. Before the Octet 8 incident, I was a licensed pipe fitter and maintenance contractor, working the mid-tier transit infrastructure that connected human-occupied space to the outer shipping lanes. The work was ordinary. You went where the contracts were. You fixed what was broken. You invoiced the station authority, and you came home. I had 6 children, a wife named Magda who was working a medical placement in a system 2 jump points away, and a dog named Kulas who had been with me since my 3rd contract, 8 years before any of this happened. Kulas was a large mixed-breed animal of unclear ancestry. Some people said Labrador, some said Mastiff. One alien administrator at a previous posting had called him a bioform of ambiguous threat classification, while filing a formal complaint about him sleeping on the transit authority's waiting bench. Tan, with a broad head and deep-set brown eyes that didn't move quickly but didn't miss anything, and a gray muzzle that had come in early. He was graying at 3 years old, which the vet said was just genetics, nothing to worry about. By 8 years, the gray had spread up along his cheeks and over his brow, so that he had the face of an animal that had made a decision a long time ago to take things seriously, and had been following through on that decision ever since. He went everywhere with me. That was not unusual for contractors working long postings. The regulations allowed it. I had his papers, his vaccination records, his transit clearance, everything filed correctly in a folder I kept in the same hard case as my torque calibrators. He was well behaved, and he didn't bother anyone who didn't bother him first. I'd had him cleared for 14 separate station postings across 6 years. Nobody ever made serious trouble about it for long. He had a way of sitting down in the middle of a disagreement and looking at the person making the most noise, and the noise usually stopped on its own. I never fully understood the mechanism of that. I stopped trying to analyze it somewhere around year 4 and just accepted it as a feature of working with him. His previous life before I got him was unclear. The registry said he had been a working dog at a shipping depot in a port district, trained for security work, then retired from that posting when the depot changed management. The new management had different preferences for their security arrangements. I got him through a contractor friend who knew the depot handler, and the depot handler said, and I remember this specifically because I wrote it in my log at the time, for reasons I couldn't articulate, he said, "This dog will tell you things before you know them yourself. He'll watch a room and he'll let you know. Pay attention." I paid attention. 8 years I paid attention. And the handler was right. Octet 8 was a way station posting, not glamorous. The station itself was a mid-sized transit hub, of the kind that gets built quickly during expansion periods, and then maintained indefinitely, because nobody wants to fund a replacement. It sat at the junction of 2 commercial shipping lanes and 1 military corridor, serviced 3 species of regular traffic, plus the human-civilian contingent, that ran the fuel exchange and the food service block on level 4. I was hired to address a recurring pressure issue in the coolant distribution network on levels 2 through 5. It was a 3-week job, maybe 4, the kind of contract you take because it's steady and the station authority pays on time. Brought my tools, my documentation, and Kulas. I arrived on a Tuesday. Pressure problem was in a junction fitting on level 3, which I identified on Wednesday, and the parts I needed were on back order. So I waited, did some preliminary work on the secondary lines, ate bad food in the level 4 canteen, and let Kulas walk the corridors with me on his lead while I mapped the rest of the network for any ancillary issues. This is how I worked. Patient, thorough. The kind of contractor who reads the whole system before touching anything, because a system is never just one problem. The problem they hired you to fix is usually downstream of 3 other problems they haven't noticed yet. You find those too. You note them. You invoice for the ones you're authorized to address and flag the rest in the report so the next person who comes along knows what they're looking at. By Thursday, I had a fairly complete picture of Octet 8's maintenance infrastructure, including several issues that were not in my contract scope, but that I noted anyway. Among them, an undersized coupling nut on the secondary access hatch in Sub-Bay 1A, a bleed-off issue in the thermal exchange system that was causing the exchange vents under Level 2 to run hotter than spec, a section of maintenance corridor between Sub-Bay 3C and Sub-Bay 1A that was not on any publicly available station schematic, because the station authority had specifically omitted it from documentation given to tenants and operators, for reasons that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with not wanting contractors to go places they hadn't been paid to go. I noted all of this. I filed it in my work log. I went to bed Thursday night with a clear picture of what I had been hired to do and a reasonable estimate of when the parts would arrive. The Walla Walla faction arrived on a Friday. I want to be careful here about what I say and don't say. What I know about them comes partly from the debrief and partly from what I observed myself, and I want to be clear about which is which. What I know from the debrief, they were a splinter element of a larger alien coalition, high-energy biological organisms who had undergone enhancement procedures involving a compound that stored and released enormous amounts of kinetic and thermal energy through the tissue. The compound was their weapon and their fuel simultaneously. The individuals in the assault team ran at body temperatures that would have incapacitated a human being in minutes. Their biology was not accidental. It was designed for what they were doing, and they had been doing it long enough that they were very good at it. They moved through stations and transports with a practiced efficiency that the debrief characterized as indicating extensive prior experience with exactly this kind of operation. The leadership element, a command-tier operative that the station record eventually labeled Mutaman, though I suspect that wasn't his name in his own language, just the closest phonetic approximation anyone managed to file, was a different order of dangerous altogether. The debrief said his tissue had been engineered specifically for assault and hold operations. He was large. He radiated heat at a constant output that would char ordinary decking on sustained contact. He had been designed by a Dr. Powers, who was the faction's scientific architect and who survived the incident by being on a different ship. Dr. Powers had spent a long time building something that could take a station and hold it against any conventional response, and by most measures he had done a competent job of it. The gap in his engineering, as far as I can tell, was that he had not accounted for old dogs or tired plumbers, and this was because both of those things are easy to overlook. I didn't know any of this on Friday, when the lights on Level 3 went red and the intercom said, in 3 languages, that the station was in lockdown and then went silent. What I knew on Friday was, I was in Junction Sub-Bay 3C, which was a maintenance access corridor between the inner hull and the coolant distribution manifold, and nobody knew I was there. I had my tools, my lunch in a container I hadn't opened yet, 3 liters of water, and Kulas, who had been asleep on a folded moving blanket near the access hatch, and who woke up the moment the lights changed and sat upright without making a sound. Looked at him. He was looking at the hatch. His ears were forward, his tail was still. I sat down beside the coolant manifold and waited. The sound came through the hull before any information did. A low rhythmic impact, like something walking that was too heavy for the decking to absorb quietly. Then a smell. Not smoke exactly, more like hot metal, the way a pipe smells when you're running a torch too close for too long. Then the intercom crackled once, said something in a language I didn't recognize, and cut out again. I stayed where I was for 45 minutes. Then I cracked the access hatch 2 centimeters and listened. The main Level 3 corridor was quiet. I could see through the gap that 2 of the overhead light panels had been knocked out. There was a scorch mark on the far wall that was still faintly smoking. The smell of hot metal was stronger out there. The decking in front of the mark had a different texture than the surrounding metal, slightly blistered, the way hull plating looks when it's been in contact with something much hotter than it was designed to handle. I closed the hatch. I sat back down. Kulas had not moved from his sitting position. He was still watching the hatch. I had seen him do this before, hold a position without apparent effort for much longer than seemed comfortable. But seeing it in the context of the locked-down station and the scorched corridor outside made it feel different, like he had already finished making a decision that I was still in the process of understanding. I ate my lunch. It seemed like the practical thing to do. I didn't know how long I was going to be in that corridor, and a hungry man makes bad decisions. Kulas accepted half a flatbread from me and ate it without taking his eyes off the hatch. I gave him the last of my water in my empty lunch container, and he drank it in 3 laps and then returned to watching the hatch. I had known him for 8 years, and I had never once seen him look at a hatch the way he was looking at that one. The first useful information came about 2 hours after lockdown, when I managed to get a partial signal on my contractor's communicator from a station employee named Ding Dong, who was hiding in the level 4 food service kitchen with a cook named Cadio and 3 civilian passengers. Ding Dong was panicked and speaking quickly, and his signal kept breaking, but I gathered the following. The outer ring had been breached at 2 points. The command deck had been taken in the first hour. The faction he called the Burn men had moved through level 5 with a speed that the station's security contingent had not been able to match, and those security officers were now not operational, which I understood to mean they were dead. Fleet Command had acknowledged the distress signal, but given an estimated response time of 22 hours. 2 hours. I asked Ding Dong if the command deck crew was alive. He said he didn't know. Asked if there were any armed personnel operational. He said, no. I asked how many civilians were unaccounted for. He said he thought maybe 12, scattered across various levels, but he had no way to confirm. I said to stay in the kitchen, keep the door sealed, don't use the communicator again unless something changed. Then I closed the channel and sat with my back against the coolant manifold and looked at the ceiling for a while. 6 children, the youngest not yet 4 years old, a station full of civilians. A faction that had taken the command deck in an hour and killed the station's security officers, and was now occupied with whatever came next in their operational plan. 2 hours, 1 pipe fitter, 1 dog, and a maintenance sub-bay that nobody knew existed. I am not a military man. I was trained as a pipe fitter, and I've been a pipe fitter for 15 years. And the skills that 15 years of pipe fitting give you are not the skills you would select if you were designing someone to deal with a military situation, but they are not entirely useless either. The work teaches you to think in systems, teaches you that a system has a logic to it. And if you understand the logic, you can predict where the failures will be. It teaches you patience, because a system will not be hurried, and impatience in the wrong moment costs you the whole job. It teaches you to use what you have, because you never have everything you need, and waiting for the right tool is usually not an option when the pipe is already leaking. I looked at the dog. Then I started thinking about the station. I knew Octet 8's maintenance infrastructure, the way I knew my own tool case. 3 days of walking it, 2 additional days of mapping ancillary issues on top of the primary contract work. I knew the pressure junctions, the thermal exchange vents, the maintenance access corridors that were not on any public schematic. Knew the coupling nut in Sub-Bay 1A that was undersized for its fitting, because I had noted it in my work log on Thursday. I knew that the bleed-off issue in the thermal exchange system was causing the level 2 vents to run at a higher temperature than they were designed to handle. Because I had traced the bleed-off source to the exact junction I had been waiting for parts to fix. I knew the station, the faction knew tactics. Those are not the same kind of knowledge, and in the right circumstances, they don't compete with each other. They operate in entirely different registers, and the person who has one kind cannot easily acquire the other kind in the short time available to them. I spent the next 6 hours in the maintenance corridors. I moved slowly without lights when I didn't need them, and I kept Kulas on a short lead beside me. He didn't pull. He walked at my heel, matching my pace exactly, and twice he stopped entirely and put his body against my leg, pressing gently but firmly, which I had learned over 8 years to interpret as, "There is something ahead of us that you cannot hear yet. Wait." Both times I waited. Both times, within 2 minutes, I heard the heavy rhythmic impact of a faction patrol moving through the main corridor on the other side of the hull plating. Both times the smell of hot metal preceded them by 30 or 40 seconds, drifting through the micro gaps in the plate seams with enough concentration that Kulas could track it before my own nose registered anything. This is the thing about working alongside a dog for 8 years. You stop thinking of their capabilities as separate from yours. They become part of how you perceive the environment. I was not navigating those maintenance corridors with my own senses. I was navigating them with ours. The combination of my understanding of the station's layout and my ability to interpret what I was seeing, and Kulas's ability to perceive what I couldn't. We moved as a unit. We had always moved as a unit. Faction patrols, for all their thermal capability and military training, were navigating a station they had taken by force and did not know by familiarity. That is a meaningful difference. I want to describe what I found in the sub-bay below Level 2's thermal exchange vents, because the technical details matter for understanding what I decided to do. The thermal exchange system on Octet 8 was old and undersized for the station's current load. The bleed-off from the pressure issue I had been contracted to fix was causing the exchange vents that ran along the underside of Level 2's floor to operate at a consistently elevated temperature, not dangerous by station safety standards, but above the designed operating range. I had already documented this in my work log. What I now understood, standing beneath those vents and feeling the heat coming through the grating above me, was that the system was at capacity, and a system at capacity is a system that cannot absorb additional load without failure. The faction soldiers on Level 2 were organisms running at elevated body temperatures by design. Their thermal output was constant. It was radiating into the space of Level 2 continuously. The exchange vents were already working at the edge of their rated capacity to deal with the station's standard thermal load. The additional input from 7 organisms running far hotter than any standard tenant was, from the perspective of the exchange system, an unanticipated load on top of a system that had no remaining capacity to absorb it. I found the junction where the bleed-off was worst, the exact junction I had been waiting for parts to fix. I sat down in the sub-bay below it and thought about what I was willing to do. There is a point at which a pressurized thermal system that is at capacity receives additional load, and the result is a failure cascade. Not an explosion, not a dramatic event, just a rapid, total failure of pressure regulation along the affected branch, which expresses itself as a forceful and very hot redistribution of pressurized coolant through every available outlet, including the exchange vents. The vents opened downward into the sub-bay where I was standing, but they also opened upward into Level 2. I sat with this for a long time, not because I was uncertain about whether I was willing to do it. I was past uncertainty by that point, but because I wanted to be precise about the configuration. I was going to do something that would cause serious harm to the faction soldiers on Level 2, and I did not want to do it wrong. Not from squeamishness about the harm. From the same reason you don't want to do any pressurized system intervention wrong, which is that a mistake in the configuration does not produce a lesser's result. It produces an uncontrolled result. Kulas sat beside me in the sub-bay, watching the overhead vents with the same attention he had given the hatch in sub-bay 3C. His breathing was slow and even. The hot metal smell was coming through the vent, grating from above. I thought about my children for a moment. Then I stopped, because it wasn't useful, and I started working. The junction work took me about 40 minutes. I rigged a manual bypass with flexible conduit and bonding tape. A solution I would never submit as a standard repair, but this was not standard context. I set the configuration to redirect on a timed mechanical delay using the timer function from my pressure calibration kit, modified with the utility knife in a way I will spare the technical detail on, except to say that I have been in maintenance long enough to know what a tool can do when you need it to do something it wasn't designed for. Pulled Kulas back to sub-bay 3C, sealed the hatch, and sent a 2-second burst transmission to Ding Dong. Said, 20 minutes, kitchen floor, stay low. Then I waited. I want to be precise about what happened. The debrief report used language I was comfortable with. I had triggered a maintenance failure in an overstressed system. The consequence of that failure was that 7 faction soldiers on level 2 were subjected to a sudden, pressurized discharge of superheated coolant through the exchange vents. Organisms running at elevated thermal load met an external thermal event that overwhelmed their regulation systems, not through direct injury but through the same mechanism that kills a man with a high fever when you add more heat. They did not die. They became severely incapacitated. 7 soldiers pulled back from level 2 and spent the following 6 hours unable to regulate, unable to perform their operational function, reporting to their command element that level 2 had been compromised by a system failure, which it had. I take responsibility for that consequence. I would do it again. What I did not plan for was Mutamon. I knew from Ding Dong's report that there was a primary operative on station, but I did not know his specific capabilities or his current location. I found out about 3 hours after the level 2 event, when my communicator picked up a fragmented burst from the command deck. Someone had managed to get out through a narrow band channel that the faction's jamming hadn't fully covered. The voice was a woman's, controlled and efficient, with the specific flatness of someone speaking under significant stress, who had made a decision not to let the stress into her voice. She identified herself as Mystica, the station operations officer. She said 2 things clearly before the signal broke. She said that the primary operative had left the command deck, and she said that he was moving toward the reactor core. The reactor core on Octet 8 was on level 1. The maintenance access for level 1 ran directly through Subbay 3C. I had approximately 15 minutes. I will not pretend I was not afraid. I was afraid in a very specific way, the kind of fear that doesn't make your hands shake because it has grown too large for that. It compresses instead, becomes a weight in the chest, becomes a very still and clarifying thing that is not useful to mistake for calm, but which functions similarly in the short term. I sat with it for about 30 seconds. Then I put it somewhere that wasn't my hands and started thinking about the reactor core. Core on Octet 8 had a coolant purge mechanism. Every station-class reactor of this type has one, a safety feature designed to rapidly depressurize and flood the core's secondary chamber with inert gas in the event of an overheating incident. Gas itself was not toxic, it was cold. It came out of the storage cylinders at -40 degrees and displaced all other atmosphere in a sealed space within approximately 90 seconds. It was designed for the core's secondary chamber, which was fully sealed. Sub-Bay 1A, the maintenance access bay adjacent to the core, was not sealed in the same way. It had ventilation ducts that kept it operational for human workers, but it was nearly sealed. Nearly, with the maintenance hatch and the secondary access hatch both closed, meant a much smaller space exchanging air much more slowly. Purge manual trigger was in Sub-Bay 1A. Sub-Bay 1A connected to the maintenance corridor I had been working in for 6 hours, through a passage that I had walked 3 times already. I thought about Mystica's voice. I thought about the command deck crew. I thought about 22 hours, and what was left of it. Then I moved. I went through the maintenance corridor as fast as I could, without making noise I couldn't control. Kula's at my heel on a short lead. He didn't slow me down, he matched me exactly. 8 minutes, through the corridor, through 2 junction bays, down a service ladder that I had greased myself on day 3 because it was sticking, and we came through the access hatch, into Sub-Bay 1A. The hatch behind us. I checked the secondary access hatch, still sealed from the core antechamber side. Purge mechanism was on the wall to my right, exactly where my preliminary mapping had placed it. A standard yellow-handled assembly with a safety cover and a 2-stage trigger requiring a 2-second hold. Positioned myself beside it. I checked my other hand. The wrench was there. A heavy torque wrench. A 40-centimeter Pina Industries model, the kind you use on large coupling nuts when you need to persuade them. I could feel the heat before I heard him. It came through the secondary hatch as a directional pressure. The way the sun feels on your face when you step into full sunlight from shade. Except this was not sunlight, and it was coming from the wrong direction and it was getting stronger. The air between me and the hatch warped slightly, a heat shimmer visible in the sub-bay's overhead light. The hatch's surface temperature was rising. I watched the paint on the frame begin to change color in a gradual, even way, the way metal looks when a torch is applied too close. Nicholas sat down beside me and looked at the secondary hatch. His ears were forward. His tail was still. I had my left hand on the purge mechanism's safety cover. I had the wrench in my right hand. I thought about the undersized coupling nut on the secondary hatch seal, the one I had noted in my work log on Thursday, and about exactly how much force a 40-centimeter torque wrench would apply to it, and about what the emergency lock did when the coupling failed. The hatch opened. He filled the frame. That is the first thing. He filled it in the way that something does, when it was built to do exactly this, to come through a door, and have the door no longer matter once it was through. The heat that entered the sub-bay with him was a physical pressure, a compression of the air against my chest. A change in the room as immediate as a weather event. The air above his shoulders distorted. Whews, I could smell hot metal at a concentration I had never encountered outside of a welding environment. Feel the warmth on my face across 4 meters of sub-bay. His eyes found me in under a second. Orange-cored, wide-pupiled, the eyes of a biology that sees in heat the way I see in light. He looked at the human, with the wrench, and he performed an assessment. In the assessment, I saw this from the way his posture settled, from the minimal adjustment of his stance. He found the human with the wrench to be manageable, not a serious threat. A complication that he would address briefly before continuing to the reactor core. The assessment took approximately half a second. In that half second, he was not looking at the large tan dog sitting to my left. Kula stood up. I hit the purge trigger with my left hand. I will describe what happened in the next 4 seconds as accurately as I can. The safety cover snapped back, pressed the trigger, and held it. The storage cylinders released. Discharge from a coolant purge on a station-class reactor is not a subtle event. It is a sudden total replacement of the room's atmosphere with gas at -40 degrees, and it happens fast. The temperature in sub-bay 1A dropped from roughly 45 degrees above standard because of Mutaman's ambient output to somewhere well below standard in the space of 3 to 4 seconds. Gradually, in one continuous drop like a descent, thermal regulation system was designed to maintain a differential between his body temperature and the environment. Higher the ambient temperature, the better the system functioned. The lower the ambient temperature, the harder the system worked. And the rate of heat loss from his tissue into the environment was proportional to the size of the differential between them. He was running very hot. The room had just become very cold. The physics of that was not in his favor. He staggered. He did not fall. I want to be precise about that, because the debrief asked me about it multiple times, and I think it matters. Staggered, shifted his weight, put one hand on the wall to stabilize. The hand left a scorch mark on the station plating that I saw photographed in the debrief documentation. I watched the scorch mark stop getting darker. Watched it hold. Watched it begin slowly to cool. Kulas crossed the sub-bay in 1 second. He hit Mutaman at the left knee. The knee that had taken the most weight when he staggered. And then he stepped back and sat down and looked at him. That is what happened. That is the complete description of it. There was no savaging, no dramatic struggle. A large, old dog made a single precise decision about where to apply force. Applied it, and returned to a sitting position. It was the most efficient thing I've ever seen done in a professional context. And I say that as someone who has worked alongside a great number of skilled tradespeople. Kulas understood leverage the way a good mechanic understands it. As something that exists in a specific place in a specific system and produces a predictable result when applied correctly. Mutaman went down sideways against the wall, not because a dog had attacked him, because he was an organism in severe thermal distress in a rapidly cooling environment, and his stabilizing knee had been removed. And he was already at the edge of what his regulation system could manage. I crossed to the secondary hatch in 2 steps and hit the coupling nut with the torque wrench. The 40-centimeter Pina Industries model on an undersized coupling nut, with the full weight of 15 years of this work. The nut sheared. The hatch seal engaged its emergency lock. The secondary access into the reactor core antechamber was sealed. I grabbed Kulas by the collar. We went back through the maintenance hatch into the corridor, and I sealed it behind us. Then I sat down with my back against the hull plating and let my hands shake, which they had been waiting to do for 6 hours, and which they did for about a minute and a half before they stopped. Kulas sat beside me and put his gray muzzle on my knee. I sat there for a while. The corridor was quiet except for the sound of the station's systems running their ordinary work around us. The circulation fans, the pressure fluctuation in the secondary lines, the subtle percussion of a transit hub doing its job regardless of what was happening on its upper levels. The station didn't care that it had been invaded. It kept moving air and managing pressure and cycling its thermal exchange system, and it would continue to do that, whether I did anything useful or not. Thought about that for a while. Then I used the communicator to send another burst to Ding Dong. It said, "Stay put. Coming down soon." The operational part of what I did on Octet 8 ended there, more or less. What the debrief documented afterward. Mystica and 2 surviving command deck crew members were able to retake partial station control once Mutaman's assault on the core was suspended, because the faction's operational plan apparently required coordination between Mutaman and the command deck. And without that coordination, the remaining soldiers on level 2 were operating without direction, on top of being in severe thermal distress. The fleet response element arrived at hour 18. 4 hours ahead of the quoted estimate, because of the narrow band signal Mystica had managed to get out. Ding Dong and Cadio had remained in the kitchen on level 4 as instructed. 3 civilian passengers with them were unharmed. The command deck crew had 1 fatality and 2 injuries. Psh! The total station casualties were fewer than the debrief team said. They typically expected from an operation of this type. I was in the level 3 maintenance corridor when the response team came through. Sitting at the junction I had been hired to repair, eating the last of a ration bar I had found in my tool case. And I want to say here that I had found it at the very bottom of the case, under the conduit and the bonding tape. And it was a variety I didn't particularly like, but it was the last thing in the case that was food, and I ate it completely. Because after a day like that, you eat what you have. Kulas was asleep on the moving blanket. Response team's point element was an armored Marine corporal who opened the maintenance hatch without warning. Saw a man in contractor coveralls eating a ration bar beside an asleep dog, and said something that I will not repeat because my children may read this, but which conveyed a level of surprise consistent with the situation. I identified myself, stated my contractor number, and gave him the location of Subbay 1A and the status of the emergency locked secondary hatch. I gave him the names and locations of the civilians I knew about, the structural status of the level 2 thermal exchange system, and a summary of the junction work I had done in the bleed-off Subbay, so that the response team's engineers would understand why the vent system had failed, and not spend time troubleshooting a problem that was already solved. He wrote all of this down. He was a competent young man, doing his job efficiently in a confusing situation, and I had no complaints about the way he handled it. Then he looked at Kulas. He said, "Is that a dog?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Has the dog been here the whole time?" I said, "Yes." He stood there and looked at Kulas sleeping on the moving blanket for a while. His expression was the expression of someone integrating new information that doesn't fit into the framework they brought to the situation. Then Kulas opened one eye, confirmed that the corporal was not a threat, and went back to sleep. Corporal did not say anything else about it. He filed his report. The debrief used language that I found technically accurate and experientially incomplete. As I said at the beginning, report described what I had done. It described the junction work and the purge mechanism and the emergency lock. It described Mutaman's location and thermal state when the response team reached Subbay 1A, and described the condition of the secondary hatch seal, and described the operations officer Mystica's role in retaking command deck control. It was a thorough document. It covered everything that the fleet needed to know. The footnote about Kulas said, "Civilian-owned domestic animal present on station during the incident. No injuries sustained." I have read that footnote many times. I understand what it is for. Debrief Brief reports are functional documents, and Kulas's role in the incident does not fit into any of the categories that those documents contain, because the categories are built for military actions, and equipment assessments and personnel evaluations, and none of those frameworks include the concept of a dog deciding when to be still and when to move and choosing correctly every single time. No injuries sustained. That is true, and that is the end of what the record says. I thought about it on the transit home, sitting in a cheap seat on a commercial carrier, with Kulas taking up the leg space in front of me, and the burn on my forearm in the medic's tape. I thought about the half-second Muda man had spent looking at me and not at the dog. I thought about 6 hours in the maintenance corridors, the patrols on the other side of the hull plating, the way Kulas had pressed against my leg each time, and held the position, and been right. I thought about every posting over 8 years. The waiting rooms and transit lounges and operations offices, the depot handler, who had said this dog will tell you things before you know them yourself, the alien administrator, who had filed a complaint about the waiting bench. I thought about how long Kulas had been doing his work in the same quiet way that I had been doing mine, showing up, paying attention, not wasting the attention on things that didn't need it, knowing the difference between what was and wasn't worth watching, and being right about that difference, consistently enough that you stopped questioning it and started treating it as information. The official record calls him a domestic animal present at the incident. I know what that means, and I know what it doesn't. When I got home, Patatang opened the gate, and she looked at the burn on my arm, and then she looked at Kulas, and she asked if the dog was okay. Not am I okay, the dog. I told her he was fine, and she wrapped both arms around his neck, and he stood there and let her, and breathed slowly, the way he always did. I signed the incident report. I filed the contract repair documentation, because the parts had arrived while I was on station, and the junction work still needed to be completed, and I was not going to leave the station authority without a finished job, because someone had tried to take the reactor core in the middle of it. I invoiced them for the additional days and included a line item for emergency maintenance interventions, which they paid without comment. Never heard from the fleet debrief office again. Kulas is 11 years old now. The hip is stiffer than it was, sleeps more than he used to, which I understand, because 8 years of being correct about things is tiring work, even for something built the way he is. He still does not bark unless he means it. When he does, the room gets quiet. Still, every time without exception, he sleeps at the foot of my bunk, or on the couch when he thinks I'm not watching, and in the evenings he sits outside with me when the children are doing their schoolwork inside, and he watches the street with the same unhurried completeness he has always given to whatever he decided was worth watching. Patatang reads to him sometimes in the evenings. She sits on the step, and he puts his head in her lap, and she reads to him out of whatever she is reading for school, and he breathes slowly and does not move. She tells him things I am not supposed to hear. I have no idea whether he understands the words. I am certain, after 11 years, that he understands everything important. I have been on 4 contracts since Octet 8. None of them have all involved anything like what happened there. Ordinary jobs, pressure fittings, coolant lines, thermal exchange systems. The kind of work that doesn't make it into any debrief document, and doesn't need to. On my last contract, a transit hub, posting on a quiet station of quiet, there was a young Valeth administrator in the operations office who had never worked with human contractors before. He spent the first morning watching Kulas with the particular combination of wariness and forced composures that you see in people who have read the documentation and are not sure what to do with the real thing in front of them. Toward midday he asked me, in the careful way of someone who had prepared the question in advance, whether the animal was safe to have in an operations environment. I said yes, he said. The documentation we reviewed suggested that terrestrial quadrupeds of significant mass could be classified as a threat in certain contexts. I said the documentation was not wrong about that. He considered this. Then he said, does it make decisions? I thought about Sub-Bay 1A, thought about the half-second, and the knee, and the precise economy of what had been done with exactly as much as was needed, and not one thing more. I said yes, very good ones. He wrote something down. I don't know what he wrote. He did not file a formal complaint. Kulas walked with me to the pressure junction I was contracted to inspect, and he sat beside my tool case while I worked, and he breathed slowly in the way he always had, the way that makes a room feel steadier than it is. The work was ordinary. The work is always ordinary. That is what I want Patang to understand someday, when she is old enough for this version of the story. That the ordinary work is not separate from everything else, not a pause between the things that matter. It is the whole of it. You go where the contracts are. You read the system before you touch it. You pay attention. You use what you have. You come home. I think about what the faction built when they built Mudaman. The engineering, the design, the specific architecture of something meant to be too large and too hot to be approached. Think about what Dr. Rex Powers was accounting for and what he wasn't. He was accounting for soldiers, for military responses, things that were built, as he was building, with the explicit purpose of dealing with threats. He was not accounting for a man whose purpose was to fix what was broken and go home. He was not accounting for a dog whose purpose, as near as I have ever been able to determine, was simply to pay attention and be right. The faction made a calculation. In the calculation, they were thorough. They modeled response capabilities of the station's security element, the fleet's response time, the structural vulnerabilities of the outer ring. They did not model a pipe fitter who had spent 3 days mapping the maintenance corridors and a dog who had spent 6 hours deciding the hatch was worth watching. That is the gap in every calculation I have ever seen that does not end well for the people who made it. They account for the things they recognize as threats. The things they recognize as threats are usually the things that look like them. Kulas never looked like a threat. That was never the point. My youngest is 4 now. She has learned to throw a ball, which Kulas retrieves at a pace that can only be described as dignified. She throws it, he walks after it, he picks it up, he walks back, he drops it at her feet, he looks at her. She throws it again. They do this for a long time in the evenings, in the small yard in front of the house, while the neighborhood does its ordinary work around them. I sit on the step and watch them and drink bad coffee and do not think about anything much, which is an underrated thing to be able to do. Street is quiet. The children are inside. The work is ordinary. That is what I came home for. And that is all of it. And I would not have any of it without the dog. There is one more thing I want to say, and then I am done. A year after Octet 8, I took a contract at a larger station, a primary hub, the kind with a proper operations staff, and a dedicated maintenance department, and a budget that had been approved by someone who understood what maintenance actually cost. The posting was good work, interesting problems, a competent supervisor, and a station that was old enough to have accumulated the kind of institutional wear that keeps a pipe fitter honest. I was there for 2 months. Halfway through the contract, I had a conversation with a senior operations coordinator named Emerson, who had been on the station for 9 years, and who had the kind of complete, unsentimental familiarity with the facility that I recognized, because it was the same quality of knowledge I tried to bring to my work. Emerson was good at his job. He knew everything about the station's primary systems, and several things about its secondary systems that were not in any documentation, because he had learned them from the station itself over 9 years of paying attention. We were sitting in the Level 3 operations bay, going over the pressure logs for the eastern coolant loop, and Akulas was on the floor between our chairs. He was always on the floor between the chairs in whatever space I was working in, which the people I worked with either found strange or stopped noticing after the first day. And Emerson looked at him and then looked at me and said, "I heard about Octet 8. Said the debrief is on file." He said, "I know, I read the debrief. I'm asking about the part that isn't in the debrief." I told him there wasn't much to say beyond what was in the documentation. He gave me the look of a man who reads operational reports for a living and can tell the difference between a report that is complete and a report that is complete on paper. He said, "The purge mechanism in Sub 1A requires a 2-second hold on the trigger. Standard design, all stations of that class. The debrief notes that you activated it and held it for the full duration. It doesn't note how you had time to hold it for the full duration, given the ambient temperature generated by the primary operative. and the confirmed fact that you were in the same 3 by 4 meter space with him. I thought about the half-second, about what Mutaman had been looking at while Kulas was standing up. I said, the dog went first. Emerson was quiet for a moment. He looked at Kulas, who was sleeping on the operations bay floor with his gray muzzle on his paws, breathing the way he always breathed. Slow, even, the way a tide comes in and goes out, the way things do when they are entirely at rest without being anywhere near finished. Emerson said, the dog went first, and then you had enough time. I said yes. He looked at Kulas for another few seconds. Then he went back to the pressure logs. He never said anything else about it. Finished the contract, I filed my report, I invoiced the station authority, and I went home. I have thought about that conversation many times since. About how he phrased it. He didn't ask what the dog did. He didn't ask how or why. He just heard the two facts. The dog went first, and then you had enough time. And he put them together and understood the rest of it. Because he was a man who worked in systems, and he knew that in a system, the order of events is not incidental. The order is the mechanism. The dog going first was not a coincidence that happened to create time. The dog going first was the whole plan, and everything else followed from it. What I want Patatang to understand if she reads this when she is old enough. The plan was always him. Not a plan I made and then used him to execute. A plan that existed in the way Kulas existed, which was completely and without any portion held back, and which I had been learning to see for 8 years before I needed to depend on it in a 3x4 sub-bay at -40 degrees, with a very large and very hot thing coming through the door. I knew the station, I knew the purge mechanism, I knew the coupling nut. None of that would have mattered with the half-second. The half-second was his. It was specifically and only his, because the faction built their operative to be approached by things that looked like threats, and he did not look like a threat. He looked like what he was, which was an old tan dog with a gray muzzle sitting beside a pipe fitter in a maintenance sub-bay. And that is what you see when you come through a door and see him, right up until the moment he stands up. In the debriefs, they ask about improvised solutions and use of available resources and leveraging environmental factors. These are the right questions to ask in a debrief. They produce useful documentation, but they don't capture what it is to work alongside something for 8 years and develop a shared language for what the Sichuan requires. A language that does not need to be spoken because both of you already know it, because you have been practicing it in every ordinary job and every unremarkable posting and every maintenance corridor you have ever walked together. Kulas knew what the situation required in Sub-Bay 1A before I finished knowing it. He was already standing up while I was still resolving the question in my head. I don't know how to explain that except as the product of 8 years of paying attention in the same direction. I have read some of the academic literature on domestic animals and their capacity for contextual threat assessment. It is interesting, and I have no serious objections to its methodology. It describes the relevant behaviors accurately. What it does not describe, because it is not built to describe it, is what it feels like to be the person standing next to the animal when the assessment is made, to feel the weight of it shift against your leg in a dark corridor, or to see the ears go forward in the red light of a lockdown, and to know without any analysis that you are looking at something that has already finished the calculation you are still beginning. That is not mysticism. I am not a mystical man. I am a pipe fitter, and I deal in physical systems and measurable outputs and documented results. What I am saying is that 8 years of working alongside the same animal produces a form of knowledge that is not in any training manual and not in any debrief report, and that this knowledge was a piece of the Octet 8 outcome, as real as the torque wrench and the purge trigger. And it is the piece that gets a footnote saying no injury sustained, and I think that is worth noting, even if I am the only person who notes it. The station authority on Octet 8, in the thank you correspondence they sent 6 weeks after the incident, acknowledged my contribution to the station's recovery, and said that my knowledge of the maintenance infrastructure had been, and here I am quoting because I kept the letter, decisive to the outcome. They enclosed a modest bonus on top of the completed contract payment, which I used to buy Kulas the best food I could find in the market near our house, and a new moving blanket to replace the one that had been left, in Sub-Bay 3C, when the response team came through, and which I never recovered. He ate the food and he slept on the blanket, and he did not appear to place any particular significance on either of these things, which was exactly right. He doesn't need significance. That's the whole of it. He does the work, and the work is enough, and then he sleeps on the blanket. I have been trying, as I said, to find the right language for this. I am not sure I have it yet. Here is the closest I have come. There are two kinds of things that go into a hard situation with you. First kind knows that the situation is hard, and carries that knowledge visibly, in the tension of the posture, the change, in the breathing, the eyes that are calculating, rather than seeing. That kind of presence is useful. It is alert, but it also transmits the hardness of the situation back to you, compounds it, makes the room feel exactly as hard as it is. The second kind goes in the same way it goes everywhere. The same pace, the same breathing, the same quality of attention it brings to the Level 4 canteen, and the transit lounge, and the operations bay with the pressure logs, which is complete, unhurried, and entirely without any performance of being unafraid. 'Cause it isn't performing. Because the category of afraid and unafraid does not structure its relationship to the situation the way it structures mine. It is paying attention. It will do what the attention tells it needs to be done. That is the whole of its relationship to the situation, and it is sufficient, and it has always been sufficient. And when you are standing next to it, in a room that is getting hotter, and the heat is coming from the wrong direction, that quality of attention beside you is the most stabilizing thing I know of. The record says no injuries sustained. The record is right. Kulas did his work and so did I, and we both came home. That's enough. That's everything. One more thing, and then I am genuinely finished. On the transit home from Octet 8, there was a Valeth couple in the seats across the aisle from me. They were traveling with what appeared to be luggage for a long posting somewhere, and they were tired in the way that people who have been in transit for multiple legs are tired, which is a tiredness that sits in the face and the shoulders and doesn't let go until you've been horizontal for 8 hours. The female looked at Kulas for a while. He was on the floor with his head on his paws, which is where he always was on transit legs, because the seats didn't accommodate him, and he had no interest in trying to make them. She looked at him for a while, with the same assessing quality that some people bring to unusual things, not afraid, not dismissive, but genuinely trying to understand what they're looking at. She said to me, in the translator's approximation of her language, "What kind of animal is that?" I said, "Earth dog. Breed. His name is Kulas," she said. "What does he do?" I thought about that for a moment. About the maintenance corridors, about the bleed-off sub-bay, about the half-second, about every transit lounge and operations office over 8 years, and about the depot handler who had said this dog will tell you things before you know them yourself. I said, he pays attention, and then he does what the attention says. She considered this. Then she said, "Is that enough?" I looked at Kulas asleep on the transit floor, gray-muzzled and slow-breathing, looking like nothing in particular, looking like the entirely ordinary thing he appeared to be to everyone who hadn't spent 8 years beside him. I said, "It's been enough every time." She didn't say anything else. She went back to her own quiet and her tired husband and her long transit. Kulas slept through the rest of the leg and woke up when we docked and walked off the transit ramp at the same pace he always walked, and that was that. It has always been enough. I want to be clear about that, because the rest of this account deals in specific events, specific outcomes, and the specific mechanics of how those outcomes were achieved, and it is easy, in that specificity, to make the thing sound extraordinary. It was not extraordinary. A man who knew a station and a dog who knew the room. Those are ordinary things, and the work they did together was the natural extension of ordinary qualities applied to an extreme situation. The extraordinary outcome was the product of ordinary attention and ordinary patience, and the ordinary willingness to use what you have. Kulas is 11. I am 43. We have both slowed down somewhat. The work continues. The children are growing. My wife came home from her medical placement and found us both more gray than she left us and said, looking at the dog, that at least one of us had the excuse of being old. I told her he had earned it. She scratched his ears. He leaned into her hand. The street is quiet. The yard is small. The work is ordinary, and it is enough.